Turning this monster into a Night Lord is not an obvious kitbash, but I have a few ideas as to how this could actually work and have a really cool narrative behind it. This kit did assemble 3 versions of these monsters, and mine look more like these vampires, minus the wings. But first, I need to get some parts. This is a collection of some pretty old Chaos bits, but I have a few ideas for something in here that could actually work really well. And going through the parts, I did consider using some of these chains for the moment, but it felt a bit too Slaneshi. Luckily, as I put them down, I found these cool claws, which should work perfectly. However, when I pulled them out, I realized that I actually have some of the new Terminator arms as well. And I managed to find some of the new claws that also looked really cool. Unfortunately, when I measured them up against the model, I realized that they're so much shorter, and on this massive model, they just look a little bit weird. I also had this Terminator arm holding a gun that I just really considered for quite a while, but ultimately I ended up against it. And this really cool tube that could work really well. Now, to attach the arms and fill in the massive gaps, I'll be using some sprue goo, which is to me a thin cement with some spruce thrown in there. I found that out by watching Vince Venturella, and this stuff has just been frankly amazing to use. As the connection of the arms was in an awful state, I ended up using a large amount to fill in the gap and make sure that when I'm applying the arm, it connects quite well. I expected to have quite a difficult time with it, but fortunately enough, it actually applied really easily and they were glued on really fast. I made sure to fill in a large amount of sprue goo into the arms. That way, when it does fully dry, it'll essentially be an entire plastic connected through and through with no weak points. Afterwards, I grabbed some more sprue goo and filled in those massive gaps that were left in the connection between the arms. Now, I do want to give them some shoulder pads, however, I still wanted to make sure that there were no visible gaps. And I thought eliminating all the gaps will make the painting process easier too. If you also happen to note that the model has some weird paint on it, I did strip it off paint and it wasn't exactly a perfect job of it, so there are some little flakes. When it came to attaching this tube part, I actually couldn't find any location on the body to attach it, so that was quite disappointing, but in the end these things happen. For the shoulder pad, I found this really cool orc bit that I thought would work really well. As I'm imagining, this creature has been scavenging parts and essentially trying to repair its armor to the best of its ability. To connect the shoulder pad, I use a bit of sprue goo, that's why the part is sliding around and I had to make sure that I aligned it in the exact position I wanted it to be. Luckily, with sprue goo, you have quite a bit of time to work with it. For the second shoulder, it got a bit weirder as I had to use a Primaris part as I didn't have anything else that could work for the shoulder. However, this guy's a scavenger and why not tear something off a dead Primaris? I also got out this tiny little part that I wanted to use as a collar, however, again, same as with the tube, no matter how many times I tried to pose it, there wasn't really a good way to attach it, so ultimately I dropped it. And with that, the Night Lord slowly started to come together. For the color scheme, I'm actually not familiar with how to paint Night Lords. I've never painted a Night Lord before, so this will be my first attempt at it, but we'll see what it turns into. For the narrative of this model, my idea was essentially that this guy at some point was in a massive battle, and as he was dying, he made a deal with one of the demons to essentially prolong his life. However, his will was actually strong enough to overpower the demon. However, the demon's influence still transformed his body into this horrible bat monstrosity. There's supposed to be a large amount of demons that aren't specific to any chaos god, so this could be one of them. That's why it looks more like a random bat than one of the chaos gods. I remember reading an interesting novel that described how warp demons are created, and some of them are essentially just horrible events that happen that solidify themselves in the warp. For example, there's a powerful demon that signifies the first murder that has ever happened. But back to the paint job. After applying the blue armor and sketching on some basic lighting, I decided to create their icon as essentially his face, painting his face in the pale colors and then coloring his ears red to match it. I thought it would look really cool thematically, as well as scream out much more prominently the fact that this is a Night Lord. For the hair and all the little cables, I went with just a simple black color. For the colors, I went for more of the horse heresy colors, as frankly the gold would have looked a little bit off in this model, as I really wanted to hone in on a much more darker theme for this model. Similar with claws, instead of going for something electric, I went with these metal razor sharp claws. To highlight the hairs, I did a semi-dry brush motion. And then as I painted the rest of the model, I kept reapplying more white to the lightning as I felt like it was getting a little bit too dull compared to the rest of the model. My original intention was to actually leave the skin as this very blue color, however, I thought that going for the skin tone would actually make it look much more interesting. So I began creating a semi-interesting transition from this very blue color to a much more pale skin tone color. I was adding a tiny bit of white to my previous blue color and then essentially working my way into a Bugman's Glow, but I never had just Bugman Glow by itself. I always had just a hint of blue in there. And the transition of contrasting colors just created a very interesting visual effect that I thought accentuated the shoulder armor even more. With these colors, I essentially wanted to accentuate the duality of this creature, that it is a part demon, but at the same time, there's also a human somewhere inside of there. Afterwards, I grabbed some speed paint Grim Black and mixed up my favorite wash and began applying it all over the model. And this is where I actually ruined the entire paint job by making a very simple mistake. I use a shot glass to mix all of my washes, but I also use a shot glass to clean my brushes. And I clean my brushes with 90% isopropyl alcohol, so when I went to mix my wash, I accidentally confused the two shots as they were beside each other, and I frankly made my wash with 90% isopropyl alcohol. So when I applied my wash, it didn't, became apparent right away, but in a few minutes, as it began to dry, my paint began to liquefy, and it was quite confused as to what was happening, as I was quite certain that the previous layers had dried quite well. And once I realized the mistake I had made, it was too late. So it is what it is. But interestingly enough, when I was applying a wash, I'm pretty sure the amount of isopropyl alcohol in there was very tiny, as it wasn't melting most of the paint. It's just when I kept going over the exact area as I normally do with a wash to avoid any of the staining effect, it became quite clear to me that I was actually beginning to scrape away the paint. I did notice it in time when I was working on the skin, so when I got to the shoulder pads, I essentially left the wash there to dry and I didn't touch it at all. Therefore, it was actually able to dry perfectly and none of the paint got scraped off. It was incredibly demoralizing to see essentially all of the hard work I made previously to the skin essentially liquefy in front of my eyes. However, I am glad enough there was such a tiny amount in there that most of it had evaporated and it didn't ruin the entire paint job, just more or less set me back quite a bit. So I reapplied the skin tone, and this time went with a slightly different highlight just to do something different. Afterwards, I grabbed some contrast paint mixed in with some water and created a sort of a bloody claw effect. As personally, I cannot imagine this creature really caring about having clean weapons. And with that, this Night Lord creature was finally complete. This model actually turned out really awesome, and even though we had that horrible mistake, I think in the end I persevered enough that it looks kind of decent and has that really cool thematic look that I was hoping to go for. It definitely is kind of upsetting the fact that so much of the work got destroyed, but these things happen.